Five, four, three, two, one.
All right. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Amish Inquisition yet again, coming in your ears at 96 kilobytes per second. I'm Amish Phil.
I'm Amish Ben.
And I'm Amish Matt.
The dwarf, the cripple, and the mother of madness.
And we've got a bona fide megalithomaniac on the line. We've got Ben from UnchartedX. How you doing, Ben?
Good, mate. Good. How are you guys?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Ben.
Excellent.
Good. Yes.
Radiant.
I should clarify. It's not Amish Ben over here, I guess.
No.
You can be an honorary Amish.
Yeah.
Honorary Amish for the day. Cool.
Amish Ben, Uncharted. Or Uncharted by Amish Ben.
Uncharted Amish. Yeah.
Something like that.
Amish X.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Thanks for joining us tonight, Ben.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, thanks for the invite. I do the odd podcast myself. It's nice to be a guest on one. Cheers.
That's quite a relatively new move, isn't it? The podcast, it's been going for about a year now.
Yeah, it has. In fact, I had no idea on the metrics of them until I think Spotify just finally released a little wrapped up thing. It was my first view into the metrics, and I was like, oh, geez, there's actually a few people listening to it. But I had a lot of requests. People like, oh, I like your videos and this and that on the YouTube channel. I wish I could had them in MP3. I'd listen to them when I'm driving or working or whatever. So I was like, well, I kind of started it just by releasing the audio for the videos, and then as time went on, I started doing more podcasty type content. And at this point, I'm enjoying it, and I think it's something I want to do a bit more of because I'm a bit inconsistent. You guys, having a schedule and doing it once a week, I'm like, maybe it'll come out once a month, maybe I'll do 2 in a week. It's all over the place, but yeah,
it's like therapy for us, Ben.
Yeah, this is. Yeah.
I don't know how much weight you can put into that. I've heard different people say how important consistency is with podcasting. One argument is that it sort of builds a routine for people. We've had it before when we've missed a week where people have said, oh, what happened? I went to work on Monday.
And they need that hit, don't they?
Yeah, like methadone junkies.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can only put out content when you have it, haven't you? And I guess there's sort of a sporadic nature to your work. In that,
definitely. Yeah. Consistency is not my middle name. It's the nature of the videos and the stuff that I'm the antithesis of the typical YouTube model too, which is a lot of, it's consistent uploads and doing it frequently. And my stuff's like, maybe you get 1 or 2 a month. Mm-hmm. And depending if it's a long one, it might be like take me 6 weeks to make some videos, and some of the research and the editing process takes forever. But yeah, I'm kind of like as far away from the regular YouTube model as you can get, but that's, it's something I'm trying to work on. I always try and do I think I'll do this topic, I want to get into this one particular aspect of something, and I'll make it like a 10 or 15 minute video. And then through the research and writing, it just gets brought longer and longer, and ends up, it's happened a couple of times where like some of my longest videos started off as I'm going to do a 15-minute thing about, tube drills or something like this. And then, an hour and 15 minutes later, there's this basically a documentary on it. But yeah, it's a challenge sometimes. I'm trying to get better at doing the shorter content, but I'm forever like, I need to provide all this context, and I want to give you all of the information around how I'm making these arguments and stuff. So it's the way it goes.
Do you think there is sort of a sweet spot when it comes to sort of length of videos, in that, it is difficult to grab people's attention, isn't it, for a long form video? Do you think maybe there is a sort of a nice middle ground? It's
difficult. You see both sides of it. I have some shorter videos. I do have some. My shortest one's like 7 minutes, and then I've got some in the 15 to 20 minute range. But my most popular stuff's definitely the long format. And I get a lot of comments, people, because I complain about it I do these little postscripts in the videos, and I'm like, I'm trying to be faster and do shorter stuff. And you get all these comments like, no, we love the long form. So I think there's an audience for both on YouTube. Like there's people that like the long form stuff, and then there's people that prefer the shorter hits. I think it's, people depends on how much time they've got to sit down and get into something. So I see both sides of it. I can't really make up my mind. Some people are like, oh, you should do shorter videos, but a lot of the feedback I get, it's like that people seem to like my stuff being in that longer format. And it's more my nature too, to, I guess, do those longer kind of more detailed things. It's just how I write, because it's all about writing, really. My stuff, at least, it's all scripted. It's research and writing is the vast majority of the work, and then it might be a week of video editing at the end of it. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to cover both bases, but as you say, there's only so much you can do, and you can only really do content when you have it. So
yeah. Well, look at Joe Rogan. I mean, if he was before his podcast sort of blew up, if he'd gone to a TV company or a radio company and pitched it like, I'm going to do 3.5 hour conversations one-on-one, he would get laughed out of the building, wouldn't he? But yeah, it's the biggest podcast on the planet. It's massively successful. I think people are yearning. People are yearning for depth, aren't they? I
think that's what I was going to say. There's a lot of stuff on television, isn't it? It's either half an hour or an hour. But doing a podcast or doing something on YouTube, you can make it whatever sort of time length you want it to be, as long as it kind of addresses the subject. And I think like loads of people have said that, haven't they, about different kinds of things, essentially, that they want the story told properly rather than just fit to a schedule kind of thing.
I absolutely, I think you're right, and Rogan's a great example of that. I think that was always missing, that in depth, the ability to get in and explain a lot of context and really explore angles on stuff versus like a news interview, like 5 minutes with someone, and we're out of time, and thanks for coming on, and we'll move on to the next thing. Give us your soundbite and go ahead. Like, yeah, I think it's that new media and particularly podcasts, and I think this applies to the audio podcast in particular. And maybe also to some extent some of the YouTube stuff fits into that too. But yeah, I think it's people like that. I agree. And so I've stopped caring too much about it. About the length of stuff. I just, I try and make my point and write what I got to write. And as long as I'm happy with it at the end of the day, that's what it ends up looking like. So can't please everybody.
We haven't even talked about what your videos are about.
Yeah, maybe we should say that first. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for those who are listening who are sort of uninitiated in the alt history sort of YouTube community, maybe just give us an idea of what it is you're exploring, what your videos are that you're making, what subject matter.
Sure. Well, yeah, so it's the UnchartedX channel, unchartedx.com is the website. All my videos are there. It's up on YouTube, but mostly I'm exploring a lot of the evidence for, in a lot of ways, ancient high technology on a lot of these sites, getting into a lot of the mysteries and the unknowns with all of these different ancient civilizations. I've spent a lot of time traveling and filming to all of these sites and investigating them kind of firsthand. So it's all, a lot of my work's video. It's all my own footage and it's used to back up a lot of the points that I'm making. I do these deep dives into a lot of the historical accounts that come into these sites from either ancient figures of record or even like people from the Victorian era and Egypt and Egyptologists like Flinders Petrie. So it's like a deep dive into particular topics on a lot of sites, and it's not I don't just focus on kind of ancient civilizations. I think we're at a point with looking at our past that there's a significant case to be made for just rewriting the origins of our history. Overall, I'm not talking about modern history or even the ancient history as we know it, going back to ancient civilizations. I think that the part that we're missing is this, the beginnings of civilizations and the possibility that, we humans have been here for longer than we think. We've risen, we've developed civilizations before, and then we've been struck down by cataclysm. And there's this case, it's not purely just, there's all these little bits and pieces on these ancient sites. It's got a lot to do with adjacent fields of science, which I get into, things like, the Younger Dryas cataclysm, all of the paleoclimatology work that's happened. A lot of this is new science that's happened in the last 15 or 20 years. We have a lot of genetic work. We're proving that the human timeline is getting longer and longer. I mean, we thought for a long time that we were 50,000 years old as a species. Now we've got human bones. I think the latest one in Morocco was something over 300,000 years old. There's DNA evidence that shows that us and the Neanderthals split with a common ancestor as far back as 800,000 or 900,000 years old. So that's kind of like a potential window for our species. And we know that there was a massive cataclysm that happened around 12,900 years ago that coincides with a massive extinction event as well. And this is, and the science that shows what happened is pretty much all happened since around 2006. And then you kind of have this other element of like, it matches exactly what like a lot of the ancient civilizations themselves say. The Egyptians call themselves a legacy civilization. You can't find any ancient culture, or even ours for that matter, whose religion doesn't talk about their ancestors either going through massive flooding or massive fire, basically civilization ending and then barely surviving it and being forced to start again. Like there's all of these vectors, I think, that point at this idea that, maybe we've been here for longer, and maybe we've risen and been struck down by cataclysm and been forced to start again. And then all of recorded history, as far as we know, happens, civilization allegedly starts around 6,000 years ago, which is, 6,500 years after the Younger Dryas event, which wiped out all of the megafauna of North America and Europe and all those types of things. And then the other element to me is all of the contradictions in the story of history, and the evidence that the older and the further back you go, the better the work is. There's tremendous technological evidence in a lot of these sites written into the stonework itself. Like there's some achievements in the ancient world, and particularly the earliest parts of it, that are really inexplicable by the tools and the techniques that we know about in the archaeological record. It's you can't really explain the pyramids and the massive granite objects of Egypt, for example, with copper chisels and pounding stones. So, if they didn't use those tools to do it, then the whole inheritance concept, this idea that maybe they inherited some of this stuff, maybe they got a kickstart from their ancestors, which matches what they say, by the way. Maybe there's some validity to that. So those are kind of the topics that I explore and dive into. And there's all sorts of nuance and different elements. Like I spend an hour talking about tube drills, or an hour talking about the saw cuts and the evidence for that, because there's a really fascinating history with a lot of these things, and there's a lot of detail to be explored, and frankly a lot of unanswered questions that just generally ignored by the mainstream.
Yeah, one of the common things you hear about is a sort of like an emissary coming,
right,
like Viracocha or Quetzalcoatl, or I guess Osiris, or maybe Thoth. But that seems to also be a common theme about, someone coming and teaching the people that they find how to sort of reboot civilization. That's what we think, but
right.
But the sort of rules of agriculture, how to establish a civilization and stuff. This seems to be a common thread that comes around.
It does, yes. These great civilizers and these great educators come in. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of them. Imhotep may have been one as well. We don't know, but certainly
Hotep Jesus.
Who was the first one? Viracocha, sorry.
Hotep Jesus.
Hotep Jesus. Yes, indeed. But these guys do, like, that's a possibility, I think, and in a lot of cases, I think that's. So if you think of this like the human race didn't die out, although there's, funnily enough, so if you go with the idea that, call it Atlantis, call it whatever you want, so call it like a pre-Diluvian civilization that was global, it was seafaring, it was high technology, not our form of technology necessarily, but another avenue of technology. It seems likely that they had abilities to work in stone and do things that we don't know. There's all sorts of evidence in ancient maps that show that they knew the shape of the world, the dimensions of the world. They could navigate effectively. They understood longitude, which is just a tremendous challenge. They understood the cosmos. But so if you assume that cataclysm happened, then maybe some small pockets of that civilization may have continued to exist, losing capability, but surviving and retaining some knowledge. And then, as humanity comes back up and your hunter-gatherer, Stone Age kind of people grow in population enough, then it's like, okay, now it's time to go out and try and kickstart humanity again. And that's where I think potentially some of these tales come from. I mean, Viracocha, one of the things they said about him, I always find this fascinating, is that he moved in a boat that didn't have sails and it made snakes of the water, which, it's describing a wake of a boat, like a powered boat. There's all sorts of these types of accounts, and you can go back to sites like Göbekli Tepe as well, where all it sort of, everything gets turned on all at once. It's like agriculture, judicial systems, almost trade, like all of these different aspects of civilization just seem to emerge all at once in a lot of places. And it may come down to somebody coming in and organizing and kicking it off again. I don't know. It seems likely to me. And what's interesting is that when you look at, there's a recent study came out, they didn't really link it to the Younger Dryas, but there's a study that shows that there's a huge Y chromosome bottleneck bang on with the Younger Dryas. So we had this massive population decrease, particularly in the male population, just on or just after the Younger Dryas. So it's like we went through this cataclysm as well. Of course, it's a weird, the study authors kind of put it down to this somehow global change in cultural and breeding patterns all around the world, and all these unrelated and untouched sort of different diversities and genetic groups. But it correlates bang on with the Younger Dryas. It's like, well, no, we got smacked around too.
Oh, and we managed to overkill every large megafauna on the planet simultaneously.
Yeah.
Well, do you remember when we had George Howard on the Cosmic Toast? Mm-hmm. He talked about the three ideas: overkill, over ill, and over grill. We're over grill. We all got grilled.
Yeah, it's crazy. When you really get into like what species went extinct, it's equivalent to the number of large animals that are on the planet today. So I think it's over 40 kilogram in body weight. Like, so every species today of that's over 40 kilograms in body weight, that's the amount of species that went extinct back then, like in like a very short period of time, right down to like, it included a few species of birds, like 3 or 4 species of birds. And yeah, so it's like all of a sudden just this stuff just disappears, and it's, just a bunch of apparently Paleo-Indian sort of hunters roaming around. And once you sort of get into some of the mastodons and you look at there's entire islands in that Arctic region made up of nothing but mastodon bones. Like there's millions of these animals. And you're also talking about some of the biggest, most savage animals that have ever existed: the short-faced bear, the American lion, way bigger and far more scary than the predators we have today. I don't think we were the top of the top of the what do you call it, the
food chain,
top of the food chain at that point in those days. Yeah, it's kind of the overhunting hypothesis is pretty ridiculous, really, these days.
I mean, surely that's being rolled back now. Or are they still clinging on to overkill?
There are certainly people who do, and there is a bit more people suggesting like rapid climate change may have been the result, which is probably true. Like a bit more, you have almost destructive climate change in terms of like the sky's literally falling on your head. There's certainly plenty of evidence for that. Randall Carlson, he has some fantastic examples of this. There's a few areas where you have these mastodon skeletons that have been obviously well preserved. There's this one in particular, I forget where it is. It's somewhere in the northern United States or up in Canada, I think. And what happened is you have this jumble of mastodon bones. You've got like this mastodon's hip up near its head, and it's all smashed up, but the feet aren't. So what happened is this mastodon was standing in this mud, like up halfway up its legs. And the only thing that are preserved are the bones in the feet, and all of those femurs and those leg bones was sheared off. They were snapped straight off, and the rest of it was just smashed up. You've got hips up near its head. So it was literally hit by this blast. So there might have been a cosmic airburst or part of this series of impacts that likely caused that whole Younger Dryas catastrophe. You've got evidence for that in some of these bones. And it's just, I mean, it's not just mastodons and things either. You have trees and forests that are all smashed up and mixed in with these bones. Like there was a real cataclysm that happened, and you wouldn't have been able to survive it standing, probably half of the continent. There's evidence for this all over the place. The Carolina Bays, I think it's one of George's favorite topics.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the LiDAR imagery from space, or just from the flyovers of that, which is these series of elliptical bays that are all over the eastern seaboard of the United States. And these are likely the impact of ice boulders that were thrown up as secondary kind of splash damage from an impact into the Laurentide ice sheet from sort of a cosmic impact. So all this splash damage comes up. It's like a 6-minute air time, like flying all 6 minutes sort of suborbital trajectory. And all of this stuff just splatters down across the East Coast, and it's overlapping everywhere. It's literally saturation bombardment. You couldn't have survived it. Like I think a lot of these are probably contributors to that megafaunal extinction. But then you have consequent massive climate change. It plunges back into the depths of Arctic sort of glacial ice age winter. You have massive fires at the same time. You had the sun probably died out for long periods of time. You have, this affected life and everything as far down as South America, South Africa. We've got studies from the Younger Dryas in both of those places now. I mean, you had, I think it was 10% of the biomass of the planet was burning at one point, which is a crazy number.
What's the weather like, love? Oh, it's just raining icebergs.
Yeah, there's just huge ice boulders.
It's mental.
Yeah.
That's hailstone, isn't it, and a half?
Well, yeah. I mean, some of these impacts on the Carolina Bays, I mean, you're talking like a couple miles long and a mile wide kind of thing. So that's a big chunk of ice causing that.
And of course, we have this leads into sort of the flood myth, doesn't it? Because we have Meltwater Pulse 1b.
Yep. That's right.
A lot of people sort of tie to these flood myths. Maybe this is where it comes from. It's some sort of cultural memory from all those millennia, but going back.
Indeed. I have a whole video on it called, I think it's Myths, Gods, and the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. And it looks closely at the, I think in a lot of religions and books and these stories that we have, a lot of that is almost eyewitness accounts of what happened. There's particularly in I think it's Revelations, I believe anyway, but you have these, the second angel sounded his trumpet and a fiery mountain fell from the sky and eliminated all of the rivers and the land. And you have the Bhagavad Gita in the Hindu traditions, they literally talk about swarms of meteors coming down from the sky. You have some really interesting accounts of flood and also fire. And it seems to me that these are, encoded kind of eyewitness accounts of things that happened. It may not necessarily have all traced back to that Younger Dryas either. Like something that George Howard was involved in recently, which I found to be fascinating. I talked about it on my last podcast, was they may have found that the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, at a place called Tel El Hammam in Jordan. And you're talking about like 1400 BC. But this place was hit by there's a lot of evidence, and this is the result of years of study, and they published this paper that they worked on for years. But this city that they call them tells, but it was the largest city in the area at the time. But they dug into it and they just found all of this melt glass products and all of these like airburst products and extraterrestrial platinum and iridium and these huge burn layers, smashed up people, and looking at, you're talking about temperatures in excess of 2,000 or 3,000 degrees Celsius. So, and then it may well be the biblical Sodom. It was hit by essentially a cosmic airburst, and for an area of about like a diameter of I think 300 or 400 kilometers, it caused this over salting of the earth. And for like, I think it was a couple of hundred years, you couldn't do anything there. You couldn't grow anything there. It was like a complete no-go zone. And it turns into this, and God rained down fire and brimstone upon Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's how we remember these things and encode them into history, I think.
I don't think we give our ancestors enough credit. I've probably said this 1,000 times about how good oral tradition is, and using song as well is an important component. By using song and committing these stories to melody, it makes it a lot more easy to remember and then transmit forward. And if you haven't got writing, imagine, we're constantly distracted, aren't we? We're trying to distract ourselves with screens or books or whatever. Whereas when you're in that sort of situation, that would have been probably your main form of entertainment, would have been singing songs in the cave or doing cave art or whatnot. So
singing songs and doing cave art.
Yeah. Storytelling.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's that oral tradition. Like, this is how we encode and remember data. Like, we don't just remember, you don't just tell people facts. I think a lot of these stories, you can't take them literally true, but I think that's how you get a lot of this deification and personification of stories. Like, events get personalities and they get attributed to people and whatnot. But the essence of, I think, what happened in a lot of cases is in there. If you dig enough, there's grains of truth and stuff. So and that's exactly what you would have done with oral traditions. This is before writing, as you say. So these are stories that would have been told and retold and passed down through generations, and making them memorable. Like that's how oral traditions work. And that's at the root of, our current religion and everything else. Like, there's a lot of that oral tradition gets into the books that we have today and these stories. And I think there's definitely all sorts of truth and actual historical record in these in these books. I mean, you can't do archaeology in that Middle Eastern area without referencing the Bible. There's people use that constantly. It was one of the things that the critics of that Tel El Hammam study threw at them. Like they're saying, oh, this is just like biblical stories, and this is just like these guys that are religious and they're pushing an agenda. I mean, that's absolute nonsense. Every archaeology or archaeologist that does work in that area, you use the Bible. There's a lot of historically accurate information in there, locations and valleys and mountains, and you can correlate what you're looking at. It's a legitimate resource. It's one of the best preserved books from ancient times. There's other sources too, but they just knock them for saying, oh, these are just Bible bashing people that are have got an agenda or whatever. It's just the typical kind of criticism that gets thrown up on Twitter, free of context.
Yeah, it's another common trope, isn't it? That I remember hearing from when I was a child, that the Old Testament was just pure fairy tales. It was complete analogy. There was nothing, it was essentially all made up. But from studying, I've done a little bit of studying on the Old Testament, listening to courses by Old Testament scholars and whatnot, and there's so much to be gleaned from it. The problem is context and figuring out which bits were written when, who wrote which bits, what were they trying to communicate when they were writing these bits, which bits were written in the exilic period when the Israelites were trying to preserve the cultural history. It's such a complicated subject, and for people to just write it off as fairy tales is heinous. I think
it is. Yeah, it's silly. I mean, and to be honest, that Tel El Hammam story too, they literally they only briefly address it. They say this may be the biblical Sodom, but it's outside the scope of the questions that we're asking. And then it's there's 30, 40, I think it's like 50 pages of this detailed kind of analysis into the strata layer and the impact proxies and all of these shock synthesized nanodiamonds and magnetic spherules and all of these things that indicate a cosmic impact. I mean, that's the real science behind it. Like this legitimately happened, and there's we know these things happened, and it just seems like events like this happened a little more frequently than we thought they did. And certainly there's another one recently came out about the Atacama Desert. So this in some areas of the world, you have this desert glass, right, which is basically melted sand that's hot enough to turn into this glass that can become like a semi-precious substance. But they've recently did some analysis in the Atacama Desert in Chile, and they put that airburst that created this glass. They thought it was maybe grass fires or something, but again, this was, it's all permeated with platinum and all this extraterrestrial elements. It's clearly, in fact, it matched perfectly with there's a recent NASA mission to sample a comet or something. So it basically matched the type of stuff you see on cosmic bodies. And they pinned it right around that 12,000 year time frame. So it's within this one period of kind of recent trouble that the planet's had, probably. And the whole Younger Dryas impact series is likely the biggest thing to have hit the planet in the last 5 million years. I mean, it was a truly catastrophic event. It wasn't just one impact either. It was likely a series of impacts, could have been spread out over 100 years as well, as we went through a particularly busy part of the Taurid meteor stream. So this is likely where they think the source of these cosmic bodies was in something called the Taurid meteor stream. It's the broken down elements of Comet Enki, and we pass through this stream twice a year. So the planet goes through it twice a year, and there's a possibility that there's still some sort of large chunks lurking up there in that stream. But that's where I think the best science, and at least the best indication is of where this came from. But yeah, 12,500 years ago, we might have gone through a particularly busy part of it, and it just really knocked the planet around.
Sorry, go on, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, I was just wondering, it points towards to some sort of collective denial that we can be affected by things that are not in our control, doesn't it? Essentially, we don't want to believe that something like that's going to happen to us and wipe us out and get rid of everything.
Bad news for you. This planet is not a closed system. Things can come in,
It is. I don't know if how much that has to do with it, that we just don't want to admit that we're just so fragile.
If you admit, that means you have to start doing something about it.
That's it.
Rather than spending money on tanks and nukes and airplanes.
Exactly.
Yeah. You might want to spend some money, looking up at the sky and waiting for the next
I am sure
fiery death to come and...
I'm sure there is some kind of probe being crashed into an asteroid to see if they can change its trajectory.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I'm pleased to see those sort of things happening. In fact, what you just said is exactly... It's not, I've been meaning to do like the why this is important video, because that's exactly why it's important. Like why I focus on the evidence for ancient sort of high technology civilizations that have been knocked down, because as you said, people don't seem to realize that this is it. And I think I call it like a fundamental tenet or a pillar of Western civilization, or at least modern civilization, is this sort of, people don't actively think about it, but we kind of are raised to believe that we're on this sort of like a preordained path from the Stone Age to striped toothpaste, as John Anthony West would say. And we're, you know, we're in the right direction, and this couldn't happen to us. But I think if more people realize that, you know, we just know it's this cosmic hamster wheel of cataclysm and civilization, and we're just on the latest revolution, and we've risen before and we've been struck down before, that it's an altruistic goal. But I think overall, if more people realize this, it may help to change our priorities as a species. And as you say, spend a little less money on tanks and nukes, and maybe a little bit more, you know, working together. Because long term, the answer is we have to get off the planet, and eventually we've got to, if we want to survive as a species, we've got to spread out. But that's, you know, that's the real issue. Like we have, and the funny thing is, it's the cosmic impacts is the one thing that, as you say, one natural disaster or one massive cataclysmic disaster that we can do something about. We can't do anything about earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, you know, hurricanes, cyclones, stuff like that. But you know, cosmic impacts cause all of those things, by the way, and pretty much all of the biggest extinction events throughout history have been caused by cosmic impacts. Like it's far and away the biggest threat to life on the planet. Like you super volcanoes and things, yep, they can go off and they can maybe kill a continent, but they're not going to wipe out the whole planet, or they're not going to wipe out like life on the planet. And all of the big events, the big extinction events have been cosmic impacts. And that's, you know, it's inevitable with the time frame goes, the longer out in the time frame, like the probability is going to go up to 100 that it'll happen again eventually. It may be millions of years away, but it will happen. And you know, that's the challenge. As Randall Carlson likes to say, we're basically a sitting duck in a cosmic shooting gallery.
That's a key point that we've spoken about before, about technology not being a linear progression.
Yeah,
and we've come across it on the podcast. We've not really done one on the Dark Ages, the European Dark Ages, anyway. Although we've talked about it briefly, but we've got the Greek Dark Ages. Whether or not they happened depends whether you like David Roll or not.
Yeah,
and we had the Bronze Age collapse with Eric Klein. I mean, that was a whole interconnected network of civilizations. The Mediterranean G7, and you know, a lot of them never came back. You know, Mycenae didn't come back. The Hittites didn't come back. Only, you know, really only Egypt sort of came out, you know, looking decent. And it can, we've got to get this into our heads that we're not guaranteed this continual progression, and things are going to get easier and easier. We're one fragment of a comet away from going back to the Stone Age. End of the day.
Well, yeah, or self-inflicted. We're in the great silicon collapse right now, probably. Who knows? Like, Christ, try and buy a graphics card. See how far you get.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Ben, was about Robert Schoch's idea of the Younger Dryas, because he's sort of, from the latest I heard, was that he's not really into the comets. He's proposing like a solar flare sort of thing. Have you looked into that at all?
I have, yeah. So there's, I think absolutely the sun has played a role. You know, we know about events like the Carrington event, right? So we have, I think this is an event that fried telegram wires and stuff. And if it happened today, it'd probably knock out the grid, at least in North America. And we're learning more and more about the sun. You know, there's the possibility of things like micronovas and certainly big, huge solar flares that can create disaster. And I think there's room for both types of cataclysm. You can, I think there's absolutely the sun may play a role in this. That we're learning more that there may be cycles of the sun, like long-term cycles of the sun that may affect the planet. Like we don't, you know, there's a whole other, the Ben Davidson's Suspicious Observer stuff and Jean-Pierre Robelais, I think his name is, like some really interesting, I think, alternative science that's gaining some traction here and there. And that, a lot of that's looking into mechanisms of the sun and perhaps even larger systems that involve not just the sun, but the galaxy and like current sheets and all this sort of stuff. So I think there's a possibility for it, but I don't think there's much evidence that supports that hypothesis specifically at the Younger Dryas boundary. I think that's, you're talking 160 plus peer-reviewed papers now with some pretty impeccable science that points specifically at impacts. Like, not to say that solar cataclysms don't happen. They could be flares. You can also have like cosmic impacts into the sun that create some of these effects that then hit us. It's concerning. There's a few things going on the planet that's like, we've got this increasing weakening of the magnetic field on the planet. And so I don't know if you've looked into this stuff, like the magnetic field and the magnetic north and south are wobbling. They're moving. Like magnetic north's now not even in the Arctic region. It keeps moving, and the speed of the decline of the strength of our magnetic field is increasing. So it's like the decline in strength is getting faster and faster. Some people think maybe we're heading towards a pole shift.
Oh my
but if that
God.
happens, and say if we get like a solar flare or a solar event during that time when we have like a weakened magnetic field, then that could be a real problem. And I know about this other stuff, like these huge terrestrial lightning strikes that can happen as part of that generated from the sun. I think there's some interesting concepts there, and I know where Robert Schoch goes with that, and he looks at some specific evidence at Giza in Egypt that may correlate to some of that. And it's possible that maybe if that place is indeed far older than the mainstream says, then maybe that actually has happened there. But I think for the Younger Dryas, for me, I think far and away the evidence now points to this idea of cosmic impact. And we even have like things like craters like the Hiawatha crater, which they're still working on dating. They haven't drilled the core of that crater yet. They took some core samples like 50 miles away from the crater and looked at stuff, but they haven't actually gotten in and drilled the core. One thing we know about like the Hiawatha crater in Greenland is that all of the ice on top of it is 12,000 years old. So it's like, there's ice, like it kind of almost dates itself to that period. You have all these other effects where I think there's Randall Carlson's working on his thesis about all of this, and I've spent a lot of time with Randall in the last year, and he's looking at up to I think 10 different impact sites, and he's got geological evidence to kind of support those, and they're all kind of lined up in a line. A lot of this is on top of the ice, so it's you don't have exactly the kind of impact crater that you might see if it just hit the land. So yeah, I think there's a lot of science behind the impact theory for the Younger Dryas. I mean, I'm at this point figure it should just about be mainstream science, but you definitely have some people that are insisting on it being nonsense. And funnily enough, a lot of those people are like archaeologists and anthropologists. In particular, there's one guy, John Hoops, that keeps editing the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis page on Wikipedia. I got into this with him in a live stream. He called me out on Twitter. We got into because he was calling like George Howard's website the Cosmic Tusk, and on that website he has the bibliography, right? He has like the bibliography of all of the papers around the Younger Dryas, and this includes the ones for it, the ones against it, and all of the responses. Now it's overwhelmingly for. It's all mostly for, and all of the negative ones have had a response that I think comprehensively responded to them. But it's just a list of these papers. And John Hoops was calling this biased, like saying, oh, this is absolutely biased. And the Younger Dryas is nothing more than Ignatius Donnelly, like recycled comet myth. And if you want an unbiased source or information on the Younger Dryas, go to the Wikipedia page. And he's pointing everyone that talks to him on Twitter, go to the Wikipedia page. And I'm like, all right, let's go. And if you go and look at the editing history of the Wikipedia page, it's all John Hoops is like editing the whole thing. And he's calling it like a recycled Ignatius Donnelly comet myth. And he's ignoring all of the science that happened. I mean, everything, you can ignore everything that happened before 2006 when it comes to the science on the Younger Dryas. It's all pretty impeccable at this point. So I think that's some of these type of figures are probably the ones holding it back from being real accepted as mainstream science now. And I think their motivation, a lot of the archaeologists and Egyptologists, they don't like it because of the implications it has for the story of history and of civilization itself. And it's a significant clangor in the story of civilization.
I think also as well, it's something that, a topic that we've talked about a lot. It's people's careers and livelihoods as well, isn't it? And, if they've got a textbook out saying X, Y, and Z, and then they find out it's A, B, C,
That's right.
They're screwed basically, aren't they? And
people have invested their entire lives.
That's what I mean. Yeah, so
this.
You started studying it one way, you've done your PhD, you've added to it, and you write your textbook, you do your lecturing and all the rest of it, and then all of a sudden all this other evidence comes, you think, fuck. Yeah, so you just gotta. Yeah. Or what you gotta do is go on Wikipedia and start editing a page like a petty little.
Oh, it's pretty much. That's tragic, isn't it? Tragic going to the Wikipedia.
I mean, because Wikipedia is so well known for its accuracy, isn't it, in its first place?
That's where the problem is. That's where everyone goes.
Yeah.
And a lot of people believe it. Yeah. And we've seen it. It's not just this subject. It's all sorts of subjects.
Many.
Yeah.
Anything that's anti-establishment it's tough for it to get a decent hearing on Wikipedia. Like you can, it's good for basic facts and figures in a lot of cases, but it's definitely like an establishment machine. And what you said is exactly right about the establishment. I mean, part of the establishment, the nature of establishment itself is to resist change. So you have, and the way I look at kind of the mainstream established Egyptology, archaeology, anthropology field is very much like you might look at priests of a religion, right? These guys, it's not a hard science. It's not like physics or chemistry where you can do experiments and hypothesis, experiment, result kind of thing. It's an interpretation of a very loose and sparse set of evidence, and you build a story out of all of this evidence. And these guys, they're like kind of they're the experts in this story, and their livelihood, their personal sense of probably of self-worth, and their who they see themselves as is as the experts and authority on this story. And it's very much like a priest in a religion. So when you come along with something that threatens the story and like is going to pull the rug out from under the bottom of the story and to some respect, I mean, that's why you get this vitriolic response. And it's like, that's why there's not a lot of civilized debate. There's not a lot of real investigation of these issues, because I think it's personally threatening to a lot of these people. That said, I do have some hope. And this is like, was it Planck's constant, like, science advances one funeral at a time. But I have, it's not just history either. This happens in a lot of fields. But I have some hope for the next generation of archaeologists, because I've been contacted by a lot of students, like Egyptology, archaeology students, they really don't have any choice but to be confronted by some of the very good evidence that's being presented by guys like Boval, Hancock, these guys that are writing these books and posing legitimate questions. Now, the establishment like Lehner and Hawass and these guys in the field kind of grew up and they could ignore the alternative side of things. And so they're going to continue to do that and dismiss it all. But I think the next generation of academia and next generation of establishment have really not had any other option but to pay some attention to that. And they're asking the questions in class, they're reaching out, they're evaluating it. So I have some hope that there will be, at least in the future, some more open-minded kind of dialogue and investigation, because that's what this really needs. I think I'm not claiming to have any answers. Like my whole channel's basically asking questions. I occasionally I'll speculate as to what were these giant boxes in the Seraphim for, but I'm certainly looking at like how it's not possible that the Egyptians made them. So what's these other explanations for it? How can we find out? And we could find out. We could apply ourselves. We have all sorts of modern technology and tools and techniques that we can apply, and we can go look in these places and do the proper analysis and we could definitely learn stuff. But because it's all just put in this primitive box, like, no, it was copper chisels and pounding stones, bro. Like that's how it's done. Like case closed. We just don't go there. We can't look at it. Like there's no end of things we could and should be doing on these sites, but because they're controlled by these academic institutions and in some cases government institutions that have no interest in exploring these questions, they won't do it. It's super frustrating. Like I think, I'm hopeful in the next 20 or 30 years we'll actually start to apply ourselves and look at some of these questions. But in order to do that, you have to be open to the possibility that it's something other than what you say it is right now.
And these guys are often the gatekeepers as well, aren't they, for academics and researchers, especially in Egypt. If you want to, I don't know what it's like now, but if you want access to certain areas, you've got to go through Zahi Hawass. Otherwise, you won't get there. I don't know if it's he's better now.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you. He's not in charge of the Council of Antiquities anymore, but there's a new guy who seems to be a little more open. He's opening sites. But Zahi's still a powerful figure he still has a lot of weight. just still a bit of a swinging dick over there, but he's but yeah, and that's the issue. Like you can go to sites and you can get special permission to see sites, but in terms of doing work and actually investigating and doing some of this stuff, even non-invasive stuff, that's a long process. You have to be partnered up with an academic institution, and then they have to partner with the Council of Antiquities. It's one of the issues. It's like when I did a long documentary about tube drills and these core drills that are made into granite and these incredible, what seems to be evidence of a very advanced form of stonework. And the only reason that we could even have that documentary, and the only reason there's ever been any work done, is because there's one core that Flinders Petrie found that's now located in the Petrie Museum in London, and they allow researchers to actually analyze it and look at it. There's dozens of these things and dozens of the holes that they leave on Egyptian sites and in Egyptian museums that we could go and figure this out. Like, we should be doing the same sort of analysis to those, but no one's allowed to touch them. No one's allowed to see them. You can't do any of this work to them. You know, we could be scanning the statue faces with LiDAR and really understanding the perfect symmetry that's on them, but none of that's done. It's crazy. And there's to be frank, there's also even evidence of them covering up. When a scientific expedition comes up with a result that they don't like, they suppress it. There was one of the videos I have is about the discovery of the Labyrinth. Like, if you guys have ever heard of the Egyptian Labyrinth, like, it's one of the most famous structures from ancient times, reported by Herodotus to be grander than the pyramids. It's like thousands of rooms in multiple levels in this underground structure. It's like one of the biggest lost and rumored fantastic kind of constructions ever to have existed. It's reported by Diodorus Siculus, Herodotus, a whole bunch of historical figures had seen it, and it was lost to the sands of time. They found that damn thing at Hawara. Like, they partnered up. There's something called the Matahar expedition that partnered up with the Egyptian Council of Antiquities, and they found it at Hawara. It's at the site where Petrie thought it was, and they did 4 or 5 different techniques, ground penetrating radar and all this acoustic stuff, and they found it. And the whole report got suppressed. All the team members got threatened by Zahi Hawass with national security sanctions, in terms of, like, you'll never come to Egypt again, we'll put you on the blacklist. And they suppressed it. And this is part of the deal. Like, if any academic institution that works with them, you have to partner with the authorities there, and then they control the release of information. So I have a whole video on that Labyrinth. It's amazing. It's like probably the biggest discovery of our time. And it's currently sort of rotting away in the groundwater.
I was just wondering,
at Hawara,
what was the motivation for stopping its publication that they found that?
So some people think that they don't want it. It's going to have evidence of all this other stuff. I think it's political. I think the problem with the Labyrinth and Hawara is where it's located. So it's at the neck of something called the Fayum region, which is like a massive agricultural region in Egypt. It's a depression off the Nile that gets a lot of water. And so it's this huge farming area. And it's kind of, you've got this water table issue in a lot of Egypt now, and that's a consequence of them damming the Nile at Aswan. So in the 60s, they built this massive dam, and they stopped the inundation of the Nile, sort of north of there. There's no crocs north of there now too, but one of the consequences of that was that you removed the dry season, and the dry season was the thing that was keeping the water table down. So no more dry season means the water table's been rising. So you have, and that's why we've got, like, they worry about the Sphinx and they worry about other areas, because the water table's been creeping up in the last 50, 60 years. And at Hawara, you've got a couple of problems. One is that the water table's at about 5 meters below ground. The Labyrinth starts at 9 meters and it goes down from there. So it's underneath the water table. So you've got a problem with, this could be a tremendous bad consequence of them damming the Nile that they could face some blowback by. Yeah. And the other problem they have is that in order to fix that and to, say, drain, because it's a huge site, you're talking acres and acres of this site, massive site. It's like 20, 30 football field kind of size. You would, in order to, like, fix the drainage on that site, it's millions and millions and millions of dollars, like, extremely expensive. And then you'd have to mess with probably the irrigation. There's a big irrigation canal that runs right through it. It's called the Barwadi Canal, and it's been in place for 150 years. And they'd have to start messing with the irrigation water that's going to all these farmers that feeds the country. And I think what happened is, when they found this, they probably had some discussions and said, this is just too big, too expensive, too much bad PR. Just never happened. And I think, and we don't want to mess with the farmers and the irrigation rights and all this sort of stuff. And it's a shame. I do think that there'd be if they did it the opposite way and they said, look, we found it, we need help. I think there'd be enough interest in institutions all around the world that could probably get the funding to do it and to do it right, to like divert the irrigation water, like not cut off the water and then drain that site and start excavating. And it would be the biggest discovery of the century, I think.
Yeah, when we had David Roll on, and I asked him if he could go to any site in his pump, he said the Labyrinth. Going back to the granite cores.
Yep.
I'm a tradesman, a freelance tradesman, and my least favourite job in the entire world is drilling 4-inch holes in red brick.
Yeah.
Now, and I have an electric drill. I have diamond-tipped drill bits, and I just hate it. I would just rather pay someone else to do it, or just run away and just go home and cry. I just don't want anything to do with it. So please explain to me how the fuck you drill a core hole out of granite. Yeah,
it's crazy. So there's a lot to this. So there's a couple different types, right? So the detracted, so the mainstream explanation for this, and there's been some experiments done, is that, all right, you have a copper tube, you get sand and water, and you put a bow drill on it or whatever, and you go back and forth, right? You grind, you use an abrasive powder like sand or whatever, and the quartz bits in the sand eventually cut the thing, and it just slowly goes down. Now that works, and people have been doing that for years. Lots of civilizations have used bone or other sticks to like grind holes into stuff very slowly. There's another type of drill hole in Egypt, and these are ones with very discernible and definable striations, and they're spiral striations on these insides of these drill cores. They're like these lines, these grooves, and they have a particular angle, and they're suggestive of the fact that this, whatever was cutting this stuff, was basically going through it like butter. You're talking about, something like an inch of vertical, like downward travel for the drill going like 12 inches in terms of circumference. So it's and there's an angle. So, and this was it's all proven by Chris Dunn. Petrie proved it back in the day. He measured these things, looked at the angle, followed the striations. Chris Dunn's made latex molds of these things. And the interesting thing is it's something like when you compare the actual penetration rate, it's 500 times greater than we can achieve with our modern technologies, because we have these high-speed drills that penetrate into the stuff, but they spin really fast to go down and do it. And so you can measure kind of that penetration rate based on horizontal travel or circular travel, I guess. So these tube drills in Egypt are indicative of something that's about 500 times more effective in terms of how it penetrates into the granite. So how they did it, we don't really know. There's a lot of speculation as to ultrasonic drilling methods. That's certainly something that's interesting. The Snake Bros have talked to a jeweler who uses ultrasonic mechanisms to kind of embed pieces into stone. It's kind of like the Excalibur thing, and you stop this ultrasonic piece, and you cannot extract this drill bit from the stone, but it does go through hard stone if you find the right frequency to vibrate that thing at. That's a possibility. Chris Dunn speculated it could be some sort of thermal lance type stuff where it sacrifices itself. Petrie, when he looked at it, he was trying to cast it in the concept and the times of like the Egyptians. He was like, well, maybe these were bronze tubes with jeweled tips of some unknown material. And even then he's saying that it must have had like 5 or 6 tons of pressure on the drill to actually penetrate like this. So there's a huge mystery around this. We don't know how it was done, but there's certainly some evidence that it's not this grinding method that works, right? Because everyone's like, oh, you can do it with grinding it with sand and a copper chip. Sure, no one's saying you can't do that. The challenge is the results don't look anything like what we see in Egypt. And there's been a bunch of experiments in the 80s. The Penn State University over here did an experiment where they grinded sort of tubular drills into granite using a whole bunch of different abrasive substances, and then they looked at the results under electron microscope and all this stuff. And it's just, you have these very fine concentric rings It's a completely different result to these spiral grooves that you get on these drill cores in Egypt and in these drill holes. And the issue is we've only really got the one piece to analyze, which is the Petrie's core. Right. It's called Petrie's core number 7. That's in the Petrie Museum. There's a whole bunch of these other, like this is the core piece that breaks off from inside, right? Because these are hollow tools. And there's a whole bunch of these other cores that are in the museum, and there's holes all over the place in places like Abu Sir. And I think all of these we should be analyzing, and we should be doing latex molds, and we should be looking at much more closely than what we do to try and find out what's going on there. But the mainstream insists that it's not a spiral groove. They don't want to go down that path of it being a spiral groove because it has all these implications on technology and things. So everywhere in the mainstream, even with the Penn State test, they said, Petrie's core has horizontal like circles on it. It's not this spiral groove, but it's been conclusively proven that it's a spiral groove and that it's something else is going on here. But yeah, and they went so far as in a tech, and this is a point of this documentary that I get to, and something Chris Dunn pointed out, that in the very few textbooks that do talk about these methods in the modern times, they took a photo of Petrie's core and they tilted it. Like in the textbook, it's just slightly tilted to give you the impression that the grooves on it are horizontal. And he showed this in his book by actually, because he went and analyzed it, and he's like taken a reference. He shows you the drill core with like a reference frame around it, and shows you that they literally tilted the photograph in the textbook to make it look horizontal, kind of shit like that. So yeah, there's a real mystery around these tube drills, but we don't know how they did it. But they evidently had some method of doing that of drilling that we don't understand.
I expect we just go to Wikipedia and that'll have the right answer, won't it?
It might. I don't know if
I'll do it. I'll look it up after this show.
Just look it up before. Yeah.
Oh, you'll see all sorts of fun. I've got lots of.
Have you got
critics that have made videos about it and everything?
I just wanted to ask Ben about the boxes he mentioned, the Seraphims, the granite.
Please ask him about his boxes.
The giant granite boxes. Tell us about the giant granite boxes from someone who's
my favorite site. Yeah, it's my favorite site, man. The Seraphims, something else. People don't know about it. It's weird. I think it's one of the most impressive and probably the most amount of like smoking gun evidence for something else going on. So the Seraphims located at a place called Saqqara, which most people may know as the home of the Step Pyramid, allegedly the first pyramid. It's a huge site. There's all sorts of stuff at Saqqara. But so the Seraphim there is this underground. There's nothing to really see on the surface. You go down these series of steps. There's a door. You go in, but it's this underground series of galleries, caverns really, that have been carved out of the bedrock. And they're really, these aren't little tunnels. You could drive a Volkswagen down these tunnels. But inside this huge galleries and tunnels, you have 24 of the biggest single piece stone boxes you've ever seen. Like some of these boxes, you're talking 70 tons and a lid that's around 20 to 30 tons. So 100 tons all told. Single piece. So not like bolted together. These are carved from a single piece of stone and precision carved too. So the inside corners are just perfectly they're perfectly square. And Chris Dunn's been down there and measured them with some precision tools. It's one of those things I wish more people would go and measure these and look at these a little more closely. But they're incredibly impressive. And not only have they been precision carved, you have them also being machined and finished to like a mirror polish, which is not a natural quality of granite. And it's not granite's kind of like an overlaying term. Some of these are granodiorite, they're cyanite, they're all incredibly hard types of stone, 6.5, 7 on the Mohs scale type of stuff. So there's a whole number of unanswered questions when it comes to Seraphim. It's like, what the hell are these boxes doing down here is one, but how were they made? How were they transported to the site? Then how were they dragged down into these tunnels and put down in these alcoves? Because you have these main tunnels, and then it's off to the sides. You have these alcoves, these rooms where these boxes are housed, and they're like 6 feet down in the ground. So these boxes have been moved in through these tunnels and then lowered down, sort of perfectly centered in these alcoves. And what's impressive is kind of the biggest. There's a few different ranges of sizes, but the biggest box in there has something like a foot of clearance relative to the tunnel that it had to come through to get in here. So I always imagine that clip from the movie, from the Friends show, where you're trying to take a couch upstairs and turn a corner, pivot. You try and get that box in there. So I think it's a fascinating site. Like they're incredibly impressive. And there's out of all of the 24 boxes, you have 2 or 3 of them with some hieroglyphs on them. And the one that's most famous, it's literally covered in the most awful chicken scratch hieroglyphs you've ever seen. Like literally just, there's no straight lines. It's flake. It's like little chips, and it's basically been vandalized. But the entire site and all of the objects in it is dated and related into the story of history based on what's written on this box. And it's obvious to a child that the people who made these boxes didn't have anything to do with the chicken scratch writing that's been put on them. But it's deemed the most valuable one because of this writing. And that's kind of how a lot of people don't realize, but that's kind of how a lot of the Egyptology and the story of that civilization is put together. It's like the writing is what's used. Like primarily, if there's writing on stuff or in a site that they can date to a particular era and a particular pharaoh, then that's what it is. That becomes, all right, that guy had that built. He had all of this stuff built. This concept of inheritance and stuff maybe being older or stuff that was written on again later doesn't really come into the picture, even though there's evidence all over the place for this type of thing. It's not just these boxes. You literally have statues that have 4 or 5 different names on them. And there's plenty of cases where you can see that names have clearly been added later over original features, things like this. But yeah, the Seraphims, crazy. Like they worked on them down there too. Like there's unfinished boxes in the hallway. There's one left in a hallway. It's unfinished. So they weren't just moving these finished boxes in there. They were working on them down underground. There's no soot on the roof. We don't know how they lit it up. They must have had light. Like there's so many questions with the Seraphim. And there's just no good explanation for any of them. And it's just, you could not have moved those boxes in there with using manual manpower. It's just literally not even close to enough room. You're talking hundreds and hundreds of people would have been required to move one of these boxes, even a 50-ton one, which is on the smaller side for some of them. We did the math when we were down there. It's like 50 tons. It's 50,000 kilograms. Say one person can haul 200 kilograms. That's a heavy load. That's still 250 people. And it's just, there's no room for that sort of thing. It's crazy. And yeah, I love that place, man. That's the place I like to take people and show them like this, figure this out. Like there's no way you can do it using the primitive tools and techniques and technologies that we know the ancient Egyptians had. So there has to be another answer. I always come back to, well, there's 2 possibilities. Either and either of them lead to like, we need to rewrite history, because either the dynastic Egyptians, if they could do it, then we've massively underestimated their capability, their knowledge, their skill set, their tools, or they didn't do it, in which case maybe they inherited it. And there's lots of other evidence that points to scenario B here. But in either case, we need to kind of rewrite a lot of what we know about that early part of history, I think.
Yeah, the chicken scratch is outrageous. I mean, if you think these are like highly polished, immaculately constructed boxes, to then finish them with this sort of horrible graffiti, it makes absolutely zero sense. And for the mainstream to use that to put them in context, and it's the same with the Sphinx. The conventional dating of the Sphinx is so flimsy based on, this pharaoh says it's Khufu, whoever it was. He's got a date here on a stele or whatever. Oh, well, it must be him then. He built it. It's just, again, it goes back to interpretation, what you were saying before about archaeology and Egyptology. It's yeah,
it does. And I mean, and that's the thing. There's really only, most of the boxes have no writing on them in the Seraphim. And even on the one that does have writing on it, there's an empty shen, like there's an empty cartouche, which tells you that the priests were writing on it and they were going to sell that thing to whoever paid them enough money. They'd dedicate it to them. So they'd written all the stuff on there, and then there's empty cartouches which would have names added in later, like based on who they're selling it to, like because there was a priesthood that ran that place later in time, and that's how come they kind of date it to like the I think even the New Kingdom they might date that site too. But yeah, there's obvious evidence for renovation. But yeah, this is the issue. Like there's so much of that stuff, it just gets ignored. One of my recent videos was kind of looking at the obvious evidence for reuse and renovation on a lot of things like statues. I think a lot of these giant statues that even today people think Ramses II is the greatest of all the pharaohs, the most powerful guy. He was the best pharaoh because all these statues are of him and all of these sites are of him. But there's so many examples where that's all inherited and he's had his name added later, and he was notorious for doing this. We kind of It's a dirty little secret in Egyptology. People have known about it for a long time, but they just kind of ignore it. No, it's Ramses. Even though you can see, like, he's written his name over the name of other. I literally have examples of where he's erasing hieroglyphs to add his own name, and he would make sure to carve his name very deeply into these statues just so people couldn't do that easily to him. Although his son, Meren Ptah, did start doing that to him as well. Like, he learned from his dad, and then his son, once he started ruling, was doing the same thing to Ramses. But, you know, today we just attribute everything to Ramses II, and it's nonsense. Like, there's so many of those examples where it's like, we don't know who built this statue or who originally wrote it. And there's also so many other examples of things like that Serapeum box where the technology in the writing and the inscriptions doesn't remotely reflect the technology that's evident in the object itself. So you can't say that the same technology, nor even the same people, I think, did both of those pieces of work. And there's nothing to me rules out the idea that this is an older object that was inherited, found precious, the king grabbed it, and then he had his name written on it, or they put their words on it. And you go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and you pay attention to that, and you look at the perfect straight lines of the objects, you look at the reflective shiny surfaces, and then take a close look at the writing, which is clearly hand done, hammered. You can see it's not polished. A lot of the lines are like wavy, they're not straight. Yet whoever built these objects had the ability to do both those things. Like, they could polish fine inside surfaces, like the little details on fingernails and belly buttons. Like, they could have polished the hieroglyphs, and they could have made them with straight lines. So there's a massive technological mismatch on a lot of these objects, and that's one of the things that I spent a lot of time kind of pointing out.
Fucking hell, we've blown over an hour already, Ben. And we've only really talked about Egypt. We haven't got on to South America.
No, we can do that next week with you, Ben. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave us with, or before we sign out?
No, I mean, I just, it's a fascinating subject. I think, check it out. I've got a lot of videos that get into it. Some of them are deep dives. I've got a few things that try to lay the case at a high level, but yeah, the more you look into this topic, I think the more fascinating it becomes.
Absolutely.
At least that's certainly been the case for me. And it's like I said, we just talked about Egypt. You can see similar things in places like South America and whatnot. There's a tremendous amount of evidence to me that points towards this idea of, well, there was somebody else running around on the planet doing some pretty sophisticated work, long before we think civilization ever started. And something happened to them, and we're left with interpreting the remnants of multiple civilizations and thousands of years of building and destruction and quarrying, and it's a tough thing to figure out, but it's a lot of fun looking into it.
Yeah, fantastic, fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. You definitely have to come back sometime in the future, Ben.
Yeah, love to.
Yeah, it's great fun. Really enjoyed it. Don't forget to check all the links out in the show notes and find Ben's website, UnchartedX, and the YouTube channel and everything. It's brilliant. It's great being able to see the stuff on video as well and see it close up, and really makes such a world of difference from either listening to a podcast or reading a book, actually seeing it in glorious technical.
Well, I was just going to say your introductory video is about 20 minutes long. It kind of just puts in context the whole kind of argument and stuff, and I found that really helpful. It's helped me with a lot of stuff that we've talked about. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely, highly recommend it. Yeah. And it's great because I was thinking earlier, we're all big fans of we're both big fans of Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, and we at the risk of sounding morbid, these guys are like our dad's generation.
Right,
they're not going to be around forever, and it's great to see guys like yourself who are picking up the torch and going to carry it forward because we need it. There's so many questions that need answering, so it's really important. I think it's really important what you and the other guys, like Snake Bros and that are doing, bringing this information to light. So thanks so much, and it's been great.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I appreciate that, and happy to do it again at some point.
Absolutely.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks.
Cheers, guys.
All right, stay on the line for us while we play ourselves out, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Don't touch that dial.
No.